Welcome one and all to the CIArb PolicyCast, where we discuss issues on the cutting edge of ADR. And my esteemed guest today is Malik. She is a barrister and arbitrator who specializes in representing governments and corporations in commercial and investment arbitration, with extensive experience in advising governments, corporations, and international organizations. She is, among many other things, the youngest ever woman appointed to an ICSID annulment committee, a Cambridge graduate, and qualified law practitioner in New York, England, and Wales, as well as an advocate of the High Court in Pakistan and an English barrister. Additionally, we are quite happy, in fact, to bring you somewhat of breaking news here on the show, as Ms. Malik is very recently, in fact, been appointed to serve on the ICSID annulment committee on Al Masriya for operating and maintaining touristic construction, co-LC, via the state of Kuwait, along with David Pavlak and Eva Kalnina. So, Mahnaz, thank you so much for joining us, and congratulations on the appointment.
Thank you very much.
If I just may start, would you tell our viewers a little bit about yourself, your background, and your experience working in ISDS cases?
I grew up, I spent my childhood in Pakistan, and I then came to study law as an undergraduate in Cambridge, and then joined Simmons & Simmons right out of university as a law firm in London, and I spent some time in Hong Kong. So I started out sort of nearly 20 years ago, straight into international arbitration. That was, I remember, my first seat. And then, so yes, I've, in a sense, followed, my career path has followed the path of investment arbitration. I grew up in a family that my father was a civil servant. My grandfather was a politician and a businessman, and we traveled a lot, as children. So I had a very disruptive childhood, and I went to, I think, over 8 schools. So yes, all that was great training for what was to come.
It's so interesting. It leads me into my second question, which is about ISDS and how it's sometimes perhaps misunderstood or misconstrued on a global scale as a means of solving disputes. And could you summarize a little bit what ISDS are, in fact, and what the main lines of contention are surrounding it today?
So, I mean, the acronym itself, I guess, you can use that to unpick what we're talking about. ISDS is investor-state dispute settlement. Now, the first question is, where is the basis of this investor-state dispute resolution system? And you can find it in 3 ways. You can find it in a contract, you can find it in an investment treaty, you can find it in an agreement between parties, especially to submit a dispute among them. Now, so far, so good. But the second question is, well, what is the rules that apply to this system of dispute resolution? And again, if it's a contract, you've got the contractual roots and any other rules that might be present. In treaties, you have international law and any rules expressed in the treaty itself. And if you have an agreement between the parties, then you would have rules in that particular instrument. Now, this is fairly sort of non-controversial at this point, but I guess the more sort of controversial element comes in as to who hears these disputes. So we had the basis, we had the rules, and now we have the forum before which these disputes are heard. Now, that is usually ad hoc arbitration tribunals formed for a particular dispute to hear the case in front of them. And there have been several criticisms about the process by which these arbitrators are selected, their accountability, transparency, among other things. So one of the long-standing criticisms has been, these are public disputes because they involve the state and ultimately state accountability, but heard in private forums by private arbitrators. So that's the third sort of limb, really, of these disputes. So, I focus on the third dispute because the third sort of element of contention. But equally, there have been concerns about the basis, especially in treaties, because a number of states felt a little shortchanged because the treaties, large majority of them were concluded in the 80s, and not so much in the 80s, but 90s predominantly. But the disputes really came several years later in this new millennia. So they I think we're getting to grips with what ISDS meant when it was placed in the treaties. Contracts, I think, are less controversial, but increasingly a number of states and non-state actors are concerned about having, investment arbitration clauses in contracts. And finally, I don't know many agreements where two parties submit their dispute after the dispute has arisen to investor-state arbitration, but I'm sure there are some instances somewhere. So you've got sort of these sort of three limbs, and you've got a variety of concerns coming out of the procedure, as I mentioned, the basis, the way they're heard, and then the rules. So one of the concerns, I think, that's across the board is, well, what is international investment law? What are the limits of it? And where is the interface between state sovereignty and investor rights? And again, as I said, it's very much a child of the new sort of millennia, and we're really trying to understand the, where this international investment law areas is going to go in terms of its jurisprudence. But I think we've made quite a lot of progress since the early days, at least since I started practice.
Yeah, I agree with you. Continuing on the state side of things, as ISDS clauses are set to be included in emerging trade agreements between, well, for example, the UK and some third-party countries, what would you consider to be the unique selling point of ISDS as a means to safeguard foreign investments and continue movement of goods, services, and personnel post-Brexit, for example?
Well, I think, Ludvig, it really comes back to the basis, as I said. I think, and I'm going to talk about investment, both sort of within borders and cross-border investment. I think it's quite a brave decision to make an investment. And I think be a business, especially with everything else that's going on in the world right now, you realize the challenges of actually setting up an enterprise or doing business, whether it's within your own borders, let alone when you're going to a foreign country. And I think generally you want to make it as easy as possible for that business to flourish and remove any impediments that are unnecessary. And to some extent, I think ISDS plays that very important role, where you have a forum as an investor to go to if a state is acting unreasonably or there are adverse measures. Now, that concept is a very attractive concept, and should, in a sense, help investors with their investment, because it takes away an element of unnecessary risk. Now, the big question is, are states happy with giving investors a form of accountability, which can be quite expensive? At the end of the day, these are not sort of court cases. You have to spend a lot of money to fight these cases, to participate in these cases. Second, are states happy with international law accountability, as opposed to being measured under their own domestic laws and constitutional elements? And finally, are they happy with the decision making of three people that are, in a sense, independent, but also not really accountable to a particular, appointed by a particular, they are appointed by different arbitration institutions, but they are not sort of tenured judges in the standard sense of, as we understand judges to be. So those elements, both on the side of the investor, the need of it, the concerns that state might have, I think those things need to be balanced and seen in the context, as you mentioned, of the UK going in and putting it into trade agreements. Now, as you know, the UK already has an extensive range of bilateral investment treaties with, I think the last count was over 120 countries. So to answer your question directly, I don't know what ISDS is going to look like in the context of a trade agreement, given that we already have investor state provisions in those treaties, and second, given the increased debate around ISDS, whether the trading partners would be keen to agree ISDS, and the bigger question is in what form, if at all.
Well, on the subject of the actual functionality, as you described it, The European Commission has set out to establish a multilateral investment court, MIC, I think they call it, to replace ISDS. What is your take on this, and do you see any implications of such a shift, positive or negative?
Look, I think there are advantages and disadvantages either way. I mean, one of the advantages of the current system is you get to pick arbitrators from a very large pool of practitioners, often people who have, there are sort of several criticisms of acting as counsel and as arbitrator, but leaving those aside, you have people who have, flying time, say, under their belt. They're active, they've dealt with these issues as counsel. Hopefully they've researched some of those issues and learned something along the way, and then they can bring that very fresh sort of mindset to, at least from a practitioner's perspective, into their role as arbitrator. So that is helpful. You have sort of people who are fairly alert and sort of ready to deal with these issues because they've dealt with them as practitioners quite recently. I think the downside is if you have a smaller pool of tenured judges or a system where you are limiting the appointment of people, then you, in a sense, may not get the broader flexibility that you get in the investor-state mechanism. I think that is one of the concerns one would have with a system which doesn't provide the flexibility that we have under ISDS. But I think it's still early days. We don't know how it's going to work in practice, and whether it's going to be better or worse. I think it's early days. But it's good to see these initiatives come in, because I think the core concern at the end of the day is accountability. How do you resolve a dispute between an investor and a state? And there are various ways, I think, to do that. ISDS is one way of doing it, but if others can put other solutions on the table, and let's see whether they can fare better or worse.
Yeah, thank you for the answer. It's very insightful, of course. And harking back to the point of a criticism that is sometimes lodged against the whole concept of ISDS is the credibility of the process and the oversight into the process, especially that's a vocal point by state actors. And last year, CIArb, we set out our own personal proposal for ISDS reform through our ISDS discussion papers. And I was wondering what are your own views on how ISDS could be reformed in order to retain credibility or to increase transparency, even perhaps?
I think as I started off with the point I made earlier, that at the core of this is accountability. How much accountability does the state want to give to an international tribunal, and how much accountability does an investor need? And then the bigger question is, should this be also extended to other interested parties that may have a stake in the dispute, like communities and other non-state actors? So you've got to look at it with a broader dimension, really. That is the dispute. The disputes are going to be there. They've always been there. How do we resolve them? And as I mentioned, ISDS is certainly one way of doing that. But it isn't a perfect system. And I think part of the reason why there is so much debate around it is this is my own sort of theory, is the large pause between putting the system in these treaties and the disputes that came up. So if you go back into history, you remember that 1965 you had the Washington or the ICSID Convention, then you had the first BIT come up in the late 60s, 1969. There was a bit of a gap, some treaties in the 60s, then 70s, a few in the 80s, but then really 90s was the real heyday of bilateral investment treaties. And then in 2000s, you had several other treaties coming in, but the disputes kind of followed with a lag. And it wasn't really sort of well into this new millennia that you really started seeing what these treaties meant, what were the repercussions, what did fair and equitable treatment really mean. And that sort of understanding has really come in, and states are thinking, well, we've got thousands of treaties now. We know somewhat what they mean. Are we going to take back control? Are we going to live with the system as it is? Are we going to change it? What's wrong with it? And I think to sort of answer your question more directly, part of the solution is first understanding what the problem is. What are the concerns? And I think the first phase was almost a shock phase, I think, where a lot of states were sort of suddenly confronted with these very large dollar value disputes when they had to find foreign counsel who understood these issues and had to pay for that. And they were thinking, well, what have we gotten ourselves into? But now that the initial sort of shock factor has come down, I think you have people looking at what I mentioned for what ISDS is, an accountability mechanism. We take away the shock factor and emotion from it and start looking at it as a process and say, well, we've got this. What's good about it? What's bad about it? Are we going to keep it or not? And if we are going to keep it, what changes can we make? And probably if I could pick one, it would be cost. I think one of the big factors in any kind of dispute resolution is cost and time efficiency, and that goes across the board. So if you can somehow manage that, I think that would be very useful development in the system.
How do you think the ISDS debate is likely to evolve over the coming months and years? I mean, if the actual legal instrument is, as you've said, it's bound to have one sort of set of development goals. How's the actual debate going to change, do you think? And is there anything we can do as ADR practitioners to kind of bring about a more fruitful discussion about the whole concept of ISDS?
I think the debate's been quite a very large range. I mean, I've seen this over the last 10 years. As I mentioned, I mean, I was fortunate in the sense that my own career has kind of tracked that of the development of ISDS. So it's been quite interesting for me to observe. First, no one knew much about it. And then, you had a lot of NGOs getting interested in it, especially in the aftermath of some of the NAFTA decisions that were coming out in the United States. And then there was, a number of states who withdrew, if you remember, from even ICSID. And then you had countries thinking that they would terminate their treaties. And there was a lot of debate around how ISDS somehow doesn't serve the needs of states, and it's a constraint in sovereignty and development goals. And then that debate pushed forth an examination of the process of the way decisions are made, so transparency, as you mentioned, conflicts, but also the substance of where is the limit, as I mentioned, between the right of a state to regulate versus the rights of an investor to not have any adverse consequences to its investments, depending on what the treaty says. So you had all these debates taking place, and I think those debates are still ongoing. But I think you've got more awareness of these issues. And my sort of wish would be that once we can look at these from a more logical perspective, without the shock factor, without the emotional factor of a lot of countries just finding themselves in ISDS and not quite understanding why the decision to conclude them was made. So that's a very important factor in this, because a number of states, the decision to make, as I mentioned, was several years ago, and the impact is now being felt. So I think that they need to make peace, I think, with that issue, that yes, whatever reason the decision was made, well, let's examine why it was made. Now we're in it. Let's look at the system. Where are we going to do? And I think that's something states do need to look at. From an investor's perspective, I guess it is a slightly more nuanced, because you have this very valuable privilege towards accountability. It may change, it may evolve. What can you, and I keep saying, I think it's a very valuable right. What can you as investors use to do to kind of use it in a way that is responsible, that is cost effective, and in a way that you don't overspend on it, say, because states ultimately will have a limited sort of patience with the system. If it's abused, then a lot of people will withdraw. And I think finally, just at a broader international level, as people that are interested in accountability and decision making, what are the realms of investor-state arbitration? Because at the end of the day, we see a very narrow aspect of the dispute, but investments affect a whole broader range of issues. And I guess one of the big questions is, where does this fit in within the broader range of international accountability we have for investments more generally? So, sorry, a rather long-winded answer to your question, But the debate is there, and my wish would be for us to really start looking at solving the problem as opposed to airing the issues.
Thank you so much. And long-windedness is exactly what we need here. This is such an interesting topic, and you explained it very well. Thank you so much. If I could just bother you for one more, maybe if you have an industry insight or curious tidbit that our viewers might not know and that you think isn't getting its time in the limelight. Do you have something like that you can share?
I don't know if it's probably sort of the worst kept secret, but it's a very small world. And, that is one of the criticisms as well of this area, that, it is a very incestuous world. It's a very small world. And I think to some extent, the smallish aspect of the community means that we have an element of neighborhood watch. I think you can't really afford to behave too badly if you are going to live within the community, because ultimately you will have to face those people in some way or form going forward. So in a sense, I hope that engenders slightly better behavior. But at the same time, the downside is that it is a small world, and I think it can be broadened more. And I think that is something we are seeing. I mean, I'm certainly seeing more people come in from different parts of the world, different age groups, and that is all very welcome, because at least my younger colleagues have forced me to think about these issues in a slightly different way than I would have myself, say 15, 20 years ago. So yes, it's a small world, but the good news is it's growing, and I hope with the growth it continues to keep its collegiality and hopefully the checks and balances. It is obviously not a substitute for better regulation, but it's just a small tidbit I thought I'd share.
Well, thank you so much, Mahnaz, and that's the end of my questioning. So thank you so much for being with us today. It was amazing to have you on, and best of luck with your most recent appointments and future appointments as well.
Oh, thank you very much. That's very kind.
Take care.